Hey everybody, how you doing? I hope you're well. I just want to jump right in because this week we're introducing, or we already introduced yesterday with our with the videos on the early industrial labor movement, the kind of an overview of what we're going to be talking about in this unit, which is the impact of industrialization on working people, right? And there's this really interesting thing that happens in history where you have a process that affects 90, everybody in a population, but our focus for most of our study is on a very small slice of the population, right? Most of the time when we're talking about industrialization, we're talking about robber barons like J.P. Morgan, and we're talking about like people like Gould or the Vanderbilts or the Dukes, like these powerful industrial families, the Carnegies, and their impact on the world around them, right? And we're looking at like how they thought and what they did and what they were considering, and like, which is really weird because if you're doing a study of an era and you're looking at what the world looks like, it makes more sense logically to look at how this process is affecting 95 to 97% of a population, right? And unless you look at kind of what's called radical histories of the world, most of the time we spend talking about the rich. And so when we talk about the impact of industrialization, we're going to dig heavily into how working people are reacting to the changes in their lives, right? The process of urbanization and how people are reacting to that, the process of industrialization and how people are reacting to that. When we talk about the progressive era next week, because we were originally going to do that as part of this week, kind of the intro to the course, but it's talking about the socialist and labor movements, I think, is enough for this week. And we'll talk about the progressives next week as we kind of get into the lead up into World War One. And when we talk about the progressive era, we're going to be looking at what the progressive era is advocating for, but it's a middle class movement. The progressive movement is a bunch of middle class do-gooders who are trying to come to grips with the fact that they're benefiting from a society that is absolutely annihilating human beings wholesale, right? Creating incredibly bad outcomes for most of the population. And so their consternation at this reality leads them to create this like reformist movement, which is what we still live within. Honestly, like the reality is we have never gotten out of the progressive era in American politics. If you look at the way that politicians began to start speaking during the progressive era about tackling social ills, it's remarkably similar to how politicians speak today about tackling social ills, which is, you know, we'll get into the details of it next week. Suffice to say, there's a lot of similarities. I don't want to jump down that rabbit hole right now. What we're going to talk about today is working people's reactions to these things. And if we look at the history of the labor movement from the Civil War up until World War One, it's a history of people kind of finding their voices and figuring out how to actually do labor organizing and what they should be asking for. And in many cases, people will look back on the labor movement and they will criticize it for either being too conservative, in the case of like the Knights of Labor, right, who are a working people's advocacy organization that did not favor confrontation. They thought confrontation always led to bad outcomes. And so like striking and work stoppages and things like that shouldn't be a part of the conversation. Those early conservative labor organizations very rapidly evolve into some extremely radical and coherent critiques of the American political economy, right? And we see two outgrowths of this, and that's kind of what I want to center our conversation today. I want to look at the difference between the anarchist movement and the socialist movement, right? Because they're coming out of the same place, but they have very different ideologies, very different analyses, and they have very different prescriptions for how to address the issues at hand. Okay, so I'm going to post up a couple of kind of short videos on each of them, but I want to kind of give you like an overview before you watch those today. So first and foremost, we're talking about the anarchist movement, right? The anarchist movement is a movement that comes up out of the working class, just like the socialists. They are workers. They see themselves as workers. They are workers based on their relationship to the industrial mode of production. They're in the factories, and what their view of this system is that it is unsalvageable on any level, right? So the anarchists, if you want to like kind of put them up on the board and like anarchists, right? The system is rotten to the core. The entire basis of the reality, the economic and social reality in which we live is grounded in hierarchy, exploitation, and the necessary violence that is required in order to maintain that hierarchy of power and that exploitation of value, right? Of that exploitation of labor and the value that labor creates. And so their position, and this is kind of a broad brush of a, movement of lots of different diverse opinions, but broadly, they share a common belief that the system needs to be torn apart from the top down. And the tearing apart of that system, because of its violence, there should be no restraint shown other than the restraint of a strategic decision. But there should be no moral scruples about visiting violence upon people who regularly visit violence upon workers. So, for example, if you are a head of a company and you are working people to death who are, only employed by you at starvation wages out of absolute necessity, and you're taking advantage of their poverty in order to basically work them to death as they try to desperately keep their families alive, you should die. That's their analysis, right? You should die publicly, you should die horribly, right? And so the anarchists have absolutely no problem killing people, right? Their analysis, and this is not just the anarchist movement in the United States, there's also an anarchist movement in Europe that is also like, yeah, if you didn't want this to get violent, you shouldn't have started it, right? And they are part of a really interesting intellectual thread that you can see going all the way back to the peasant revolt in England in the 14th century, which is when you use violence to exploit people, you make violence part of the game. And the argument from the peasant revolt, from the Jacobins in the French Revolution to, the anarchists in the 19th century and early 20th century is, you're the one who started it. Like you've been throwing punches. You can't get mad because I'm throwing back, right? Or at least like it's ridiculous that you are angry that I'm throwing back. And so they're perfectly willing to, blow up buildings, blow up cars, shoot people, committing, public political assassinations of world leaders. They don't have any issue with that. This is something that like has largely been forgotten in our kind of public memory. The anarchist movement was like really scary for, the bourgeoisie, the capital class of owners, and the professional managers of those corporations, what we call the professional managerial class, right? The people that were like the clerks, the lawyers, the managers of the factories, right, who were put in charge of workers on the behalf of owners, to basically like maximize the profit extracted from them. that professional managerial class was terrified by the anarchist movement. And you can see, if you look back in New York Times reports, the absolute, terror that these people experienced on a daily basis, worried where the next anarchist was going to strike. Presidents, prime ministers, kings, like there are, I think between 1890 and 1910, something like every single country in Europe had at least one head of government or head of state assassinated, with the exception of England. I think that's right. But it's widespread violence. And they're not just killing politicians at the top of the food chain. They're shooting, factory managers. They're shooting people who are like, they're bringing the violence to the people who are at what they call the coalface of capitalism. And their vision of what this will achieve is to basically they called it propaganda of the deed. It was a demonstration that these people were subject to the same moral rules as all of us, right? Which is, you commit an act of violence, you deserve to have violence visited upon you. And so they looked at their killings as like morally correct. That's their view. And their vision of the future would be, if we demonstrate and we show workers their capacity to visit violence upon their oppressors, then over time, workers will start to participate in that violence spontaneously all over the place. And that workers will then take that power and spread it around and amongst themselves. The socialist movement is coming out of the same concerns. They're coming out of the same class, but they have a different analysis of how to build power. Rather than looking at this kind of righteous violence as the method for getting to the revolution, what workers said was, no, we need to meet people where they are. We need to organize them together to agitate for better conditions and to kind of slowly begin to use the pressure of our mass as a working class to force the bourgeoisie to give us better conditions, to force the bourgeoisie to give us more control over our working conditions and the value that we produce, to give us more control over our lives, to quote presidential candidate from 2020, Bernie Sanders, to democratize the workspace. Okay. And so they're looking at a very similar end point, but their methods of getting there are very different. And so anarchists and socialists often have really, really strong disagreements that are not just kind of academic about how to get from point A to point B. And the socialists are like, listen, if you organize people together and you win something, right, even if it's relatively small, it empowers them to fight again for the next thing, which could be bigger, and then the next thing, and the next thing, and you build power slowly over time, right? You build power slowly over time, and you start to build capacity to begin to build like a broader political movement that will then be able to affect change because it's representative of this collective wisdom that is coming up from below. And that the people who are leading the movement, what was called the vanguard, their job is not to make decisions on behalf of working people for their benefit. Their job is to find out what people want, find out how people want to get it, right? Find out what end goals people have, and then action them and organize people to action them, right? They are facilitators, midwives, if you will, not decision, makers. They're not rulers, right? That's the vision of a kind of a socialist democratized structure, right? what this leads to is a movement, two movements that are happening side by side, often cooperating together despite their disagreements, but moving in tandem with each other, parallel to each other at the same time, and often being confused for one another. Anarchists are called socialists constantly. Socialists are called anarchists a lot of the time. And and sometimes those lines get blurred. Like the example that is posted here is the Haymarket affair, right? The people involved in the rally at Haymarket was a coalition of socialists and anarchists who were working together to try to, like, build power among the Chicago working class, and were being very successful at it. And so, you have guys like Albert Parsons, who's who's an anarchist, and August Spies, who's an anarchist, and you also have people who are, involved, who are would consider themselves to be socialists, right? To be not so interested in that kind of radicalism. And actually, as radical as Albert Parsons was, if you ever get a chance, read about Lucy Parsons, his wife. She was even more radical than he was. So I think it's important to understand those two different threads, okay? Especially as we get into the progressive movement, looking at workers' reactions to these kind of middle-class reformist measures to deal with the horror that's happening on the ground level. So that's the introduction, and then you guys are gonna watch a video kind of detailing the anarchist movement and a video detailing the socialist movement. And I'd like you to kind of keep an account of the differences between these two movements. It's going to be important when we come to the lead up to World War I, and looking at how politics during World War I and after World War I begin to radically change in the United States. All right. All the best. I will. You guys all see me next week, and I hope you're all well.